They're called legends, or sometimes even myths. But the stories of King Solomon can be said to be the greatest of all allegories, depicting the stories of life, spiritual life. Let's see if this story of King Solomon, with the help of the big guns, will allow us to catch the thread of what are the parallels that we have experienced in our own lives. Now, King Solomon wore a ring that allowed him to know the sacred name of God. And he was given the task of building or the, as it's called, temple. But in order for him to build the temple, he had to capture the king of the demons, Asmadeus, to enable him to complete his task. Now, when the building of the temple was complete, King Solomon had the king of the demons, Asmadeus, brought to him as he was in chains. And King Solomon said to Asmadeus, "I can now set you free, but before I do so, I have a desire. I have the power to speak to the birds and the animals. I have the power over the winds. But my desire is to know the secret nature of illusion." Asmadeus said, "I can answer your question, but while you're wearing the sacred name of God, and I am enchained, I cannot do so." So King Solomon, of course, saw this was a very plausible reasons. So he had Asmadeus released from his chains, and then he handed him the ring on his finger, which allowed him to know the sacred name of God. As soon as the king of the demons had the ring in his hand, he threw it out of the window, and it flew a vast distance to land in an ocean far, far away. And then the great beast, the great demon, who was huge, came over to King Solomon, who was now without any of his powers, picked him up and threw him out of the window. So King Solomon went flying far, far, far into the distance. Finally, King Solomon landed in a place totally unknown to him. He was battered, bruised, tired, hungry, and thirsty. But staggering, he managed to find a pond. But before he drank from the pond, he saw his own reflection. No longer did he have a shining countenance. No longer was he wearing a crown. His clothes were ragged. He was a beggar. After drinking and eating a few berries from a nearby tree, he staggered down the road, and his life from that moment on was one of a beggar. He had to beg for his food. He had to beg for a place to find lodging and rest. He got work now and then. But then, one day, as he was walking in a town, it happened that the king's of that realm's cook was staggering under the heavy load of the supplies that he was taking to the palace to perform his chef's duties, when Solomon asked could he help to carry his load. And so it was that Solomon and the cook of the king became friends, and Solomon was invited to the palace to become an assistant to the cook. But one day Solomon begged the chef to allow him to cook a meal for the king. And when he did, afterwards the king called the head cook to him and said, "I have never in my life tasted food like this. Tell me, who was the cook?" And the head chef had to admit that it was his helper, a beggar who had come to join his employ. From that time on, Solomon became the head cook of the king. But in his position as head cook, he had privy to movement around the palace, and the king had a daughter. And, as the story goes, they fell in love, the princess and Solomon, the beggar. Now, so deep was their love that the princess went to her father, the king, and said that she wanted to marry. But when the king heard that it was the beggar who was his cook, he was very angry. So he exiled them from the palace, and they were sent out into the wilderness. They had nothing but the clothes that they wore. All they had was their love for one another. But Solomon had a staff, just a piece of a branch of a tree, and he still had knowledge. So he thought, this staff could be a divining rod. So he used the staff across the desert wastes, and sure enough, it led them to a place where they could dig, and water flowed from a stream under the sands. They were able to make a little life for themselves. They built a hut. They had 3 children. They were very happy. Solomon almost even forgot about what he'd been. But then, one day, Solomon awoke to see a great cloud in the distance, and that cloud became a wave of water so great it engulfed their living space. It took away his wife. He grabbed his children, but the water was too powerful, and one by one they were pulled out of his hands and grasp. Then the water carried him, tumbling him, until finally he was left. He awoke. The waters had receded, but standing above him was a band of bandits, and they took him into slavery. He became a slave. They took him to the market, and they sold him to a blacksmith. With the blacksmith, Solomon proved to be a very good worker. And it so happened that the son of the blacksmith longed to be a goldsmith. As it happened, King Solomon, or Solomon now, knew the ways of gold. He was a master craftsman of gold. So he taught the son of the blacksmith. But then one day the son of the blacksmith said, "I would like to make a gift for the king of this land." So Solomon undertook to create this, and so he did. It was a pair of doves with a leaf in their beaks. It was exquisite. And when it was brought to the king, he said, "Who made this?" And the son of the blacksmith, being an honest young man, had to admit that it was the slave of his father, who was the master craftsman. So Solomon was brought to this palace, and the king soon discovered that Solomon had great wisdom, and so he began to defer to him for knowledge and guidance. But as an aside to this story, and part of this story, it so happened that again the princess of this realm, the daughter of the king, happened to go to bed one night and have a dream. She dreamt that there was a gem more precious than any gem that had ever been known, that was in a cave that was shaped like a quarter moon. Her dream was so real that she began to pine for this gem, this jewel, so much so that she grew pale and took to her bed. But she dreamt again, and in that dream she saw a man going to that cave, entering that cave and finding the jewel. She saw his face. It was none other than Solomon, her father's advisor. So, speaking to her father, Solomon was given the task of finding this gem. He willingly set out on his quest. He went here and there, all over, years. He traveled everywhere. He asked, "Is there a cave that's shaped like the quarter moon?" No one knew of such. But then one day he was walking the beach and he heard several children speaking. "Let's go and play in the cave shaped like quarter moon." So Solomon went to them and asked them, "Where is this cave?" And they told him how to find it. So Solomon climbed and climbed, and there it was. But when he entered the cave, there was nothing there. He felt around its edges, but then in a crevice he found a stone, just a stone, It didn't have any special features. But then he took the stone and smashed it against the wall, and there appeared the gem, so exquisite. But he was tired, so he lay down to sleep. And when he awoke, he found the cave filling with water. He knew that if he remained, he would drown. But somehow he allowed himself to ride the tide as the water came in and went out. And in an instant, it seemed, he found himself back in the palace of the king. He was able to give the gem to the daughter, the princess, who immediately revived and was thrilled to have her dream fulfilled. The king asked Solomon what he would like in payment for succeeding in this quest. And in his response, Solomon related the whole story of what had happened to him, how he was a king and how he'd become a beggar. Immediately, the king gave Solomon his freedom and ordered a ship to be prepared to take him back to where he belonged. In the journeying of Solomon in the ship, there was little to do. The ship was being directed. So he decided to go fishing. When he threw his line over the side of the ship, he caught a fish, a golden fish. It was so beautiful. He did not want to give it to the ship's cooks to prepare. He decided to prepare it for himself. So in gutting the fish, what should he find but his own golden ring? When he placed the ring on his finger, he found himself back in his own palace, wearing his kingly robes and his golden crown. Asmadeus, the king of the demons, said to King Solomon, "We have been waiting for you for 1 hour. But," said King Solomon, "it has been years." Asmadeus, the king of the demons, said to King Solomon, "Now you have the answer to the question you have asked. Now set me free." King Solomon waved his arm, and Asmadeus flew off, never to be seen in that kingdom again. An allegory of our spiritual journey from beginning to end. in its deep meaning, not to ask you what those parallels are. We each know what they are. But what arises from this? What arises from this recognition when illusion, we know the secret meaning of illusion, the secret nature of illusion. And so it brings us back again, once again, to the question that's been asked over these last days. But let's turn it around now. First, it was asked, what is your relationship with life? Now, when we turn it around, it can be asked, what is life's relationship with you? How does that change things? That's what we'll explore over the coming days. Thank you. Thank you.